This controller has been built for FPS gaming and it's called the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro. It has a mostly Xbox style design with a few key differences, such as the row of function buttons along the bottom and the glowing LED lights. It's a pretty stylish looking controller, with this dark semi-transparent look. On the front of the controller you'll find a BigBig Won logo at the top with Start, Select and a screenshot button underneath. Hiding just to the bottom right of the right analog stick is the stealthy function button, which is awesome by the way, more on that later, and the aforementioned row of buttons. Along the top there's the usual shoulders and triggers, along with a USB-C port for charging, a sync button, and the M3 and M4 programmable macro keys. It should be mentioned that there's no strain relief for the USB cable here. On the bottom there's a headphone jack for pass-through audio, and on the back there's the M1 and M2 macro keys along with the trigger stop switches and pogo pins for charging using the included dock. Since this controller is built for first-person shooters and modern gaming, let's take a look at those inputs first, starting with the analog sticks. The most obvious thing to mention is that these are not Hall effect sticks, but don't click off the video just yet. Hall effect isn't everything when it comes to analog sticks, and in most cases is snake oil marketing anyway. And these sticks are very nice. They have a great amount of tension, just enough to make using them easy, but not enough to make them stiff or heavy. The steel collars on the stick itself, along with the anti-friction rings, genuinely do make this a very smooth and frictionless experience. The caps themselves have a nice texture and are very grippy. The sticks themselves actually pull off, and you get 3 different heights in the box. Interestingly, having a tall right stick and a medium height left stick seems to be an optimal experience with this controller, offering comfort on the left and incredible accuracy on the right. In first-person shooter gaming, it does seem like these sticks are incredibly accurate. A distinguishing feature of them is that they have a 12-bit axis resolution, which basically means there are 2048 or so levels between neutral and a full push. It's also possible to completely tune these sticks to the most minute detail using the BigBig Won Elite app for Android and iOS. What's even better is that you can tune them in real time whilst connected to another device. So you can be mid-game on Switch or PC and still use the app to tune the sticks and other inputs. Another defining feature of this modern controller is the 6-axis gyroscope, and it works incredibly well. You can activate the gyroscope universally for any game on any system, and you can do it either on the controller itself or using the BigBig Won app. And just like the analog sticks, you can modify the gyroscope and change the way it works while you're currently in-game. This makes it incredibly easy to set up, and the gyroscope works incredibly well. And the fact that it can be set up and dialed in while you're in-game makes this one of the most accessible gyroscope experiences out there. And when you combine a dialed-in gyroscope with the excellent analog sticks, you can achieve some really amazing aiming accuracy on the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro. Moving on to the other modern inputs, let's look at the L and R buttons. They're nice and clicky and tactile. They're very responsive and easy to tap quickly, and they have a sort of mouse click profile that's been muted a little bit, so they're not too loud but they're still very snappy. The onboard triggers are Hall effect. They feel a little bit heavier than on a typical gamepad, but they're still very nice and responsive. The sensitivity of them is great, and they can be configured and tuned in the app as well. The shape has a very comfortable outer curve with a dotted texture on top, and it seems like they've been shaped perfectly for the index fingers to wrap around them. Trigger stops are also built into the back, and with them active give the triggers around 30% of their usual travel. This is pretty handy for FPS games when you don't necessarily need to push the trigger all the way. And also on top are the M3 and M4 buttons, which have been intuitively placed. They're very easy to reach and press whether your fingers are resting on or depressing the triggers. And they can be mapped to either a macro or any other button on the controller. An example of where this might come in handy is in a racing game. You could map one of these top macro keys to the handbrake button and be able to perform a handbrake turn at a moment's notice. They really are well designed and intuitively placed, and they can be programmed using the functions on the controller itself or using the app. The M1 and the M2 paddles on the back are also very nice. They're much clickier, much closer to a mouse click than the other inputs, and they're positioned perfectly under the middle finger. Moving on to the other inputs of this controller, 3 of the 4 face buttons are fine. They use a rubber membrane connection which is okay, but nothing particularly special. When fully depressed, each of these buttons sticks up around 0.5 mm from the shell. That is, except for the B button. For some reason the B button is positioned much lower than the rest, and when depressed it goes deeper than flush with the shell. This gives it a very slippery and not very pleasant profile. The thumb just kind of wants to slip off of this button when it's pressed down. This becomes a particular problem when you're using this controller with the Nintendo Switch, because the B button acts as the A button on the Switch or any other Nintendo style game. And it is just not a very nice experience to use at all. Why there's such a stark difference between this B button and the rest of the inputs is anybody's guess, but it's the first of two major flaws on this controller. The second being the D-pad. This D-pad is just plain bad. There's no sugarcoating it, it's an awful D-pad through and through. It has a clicky profile, but the clicks just aren't tactile enough, and you can never quite feel what you're pressing unless you're looking at what your thumb is doing. And when you start to slide from the left and right directions, you'll accidentally hit up and down multiple times along the way. Included in the box you get a cross-shaped D-pad and a bowl-shaped D-pad. The bowl shape seems to be the better of the two, but either way these aren't very good at all, especially if you want to play retro games or platformers that require accurate D-pad inputs. This controller just is not good for that at all. So here we have a controller that excels in the place that it was supposed to excel, and that is in the analog sticks, triggers, and shoulders. Modern gamepad inputs. But when it comes to retro games that require input on the D-pad or the face buttons, especially the B button, it's just not a very pleasant experience at all. And it definitely feels like a lot of effort went into one area on this controller and everything else was just kind of left behind. Before I move on to the additional features of this controller, I want to do a quick polling rate test. With this controller you can use a 2.4 GHz dongle that's included in the box, Bluetooth, or a wired connection. And I'll be using X input tests to check all these out. Over 3 tests in the 2.4 GHz dongle mode, the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro gets an average polling rate of around 202 Hz, with a solid 4.9 millisecond response time. This is more or less exactly what BigBig Won claims. With Bluetooth it gets an average of 100 Hz with a 9.9 millisecond response time. And in wired mode it polls at around 1010 Hz with a 0.98 millisecond response. All of these numbers are absolutely accurate or even negligibly a little bit over what BigBig Won claims in their marketing, which is great to see. Moving on, another thing that makes this controller a very modern one is that it's packed full of additional features, including the hidden function button which is next to the right stick. This has some very surprising and interesting functions, the best of which is native volume control. When you're using X input mode on either Android or PC, you can hold the function button and press up and down on the D-pad to change your device's native volume. This is just a phenomenal feature, especially when paired with the headphone jack on the controller, which by the way works perfectly with no discernible quality loss. However, it does only work in the 2.4 GHz or the wired mode. You can double tap the function button to turn the LED lights on or off, and by holding function and pressing L3 or R3 you'll enable permanent gyroscope controls for the respective stick. Or you can hold down the function button and press one of the triggers to enable the gyroscope only when that trigger is held down. There are more features than that too, and the function button also has an indicator light that will blink or breathe depending on what you're trying to do. The rest of the controller's functions are built into the row of buttons at the bottom of the controller. There's turbo, mapping, macro, and configuration. These buttons are used to configure the features of the controller directly on the device itself without needing an app or any additional software. You can set turbo to any button, remap any button to any other, record macros to any of the 4 macro buttons, and change between 4 onboard configuration profiles. All of this is built directly into this controller and it works incredibly well once you get used to which button does what. In particular, recording macros is a breeze on this device. Just hold down the button and then press one of the 4 macro keys. Perform your inputs in-game if you like, and then press the macro button again to save it. It is incredibly convenient, and you can even clear the macro as well. And this leads on to one of the most interesting and best parts of this controller, its documentation. The BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro has by a huge margin the absolute best documentation I have ever seen for a controller. You get an incredibly detailed user manual in the box, an FAQ and support page on the BigBig Won website, and they've even recorded an absurd number of tutorial videos and walkthroughs that show you how to use each of this controller's unique functions. It sounds kind of strange for a controller, but this documentation is a phenomenal resource for learning the extensive feature set of this controller, and it's a big win for this company and product. A quick note on the application as well. The app has a very modern design that makes it really easy to understand and use. You can set up different profiles and configure every single one of the inputs on the controller. As was mentioned earlier, you can use this app while the controller is connected to any other device. And any changes you make in the app are instantly synchronized to the controller. That means you can test out your inputs in-game, configure them using the app, and really dial everything into a T. It's a really good setup. Something else that this controller does really well is the value you get with it. Inside the box you get the 2.4 GHz dongle, as well as the additional D-pad cap, the analog stick heights, a USB cable, and best of all, a charging dock. The dock itself looks smart and minimal, with a rainbow glow when the controller is attached. The dock oddly sits at a decline, but holds the controller dead straight when it's attached. The problem is that the magnets are very weak and they don't pull the controller into place unless it's already very close to being correct. This combined with the slight decline of the dock itself mean that it takes just a little bit too much attention to get the controller seated and charging. You can't just drop it on and assume that it's going to slide into place and start charging. And if it's not on correctly, the controller will just slide backwards and fall off. Of course, it's still amazing that this dock is included in the box for the price that you pay, but it's just a fact that the design could be a little bit better. One excellent feature of the dock is USB pass-through. You can attach this dock to your PC and then connect another USB device to it. For example, the 2.4 GHz dongle. With this setup, you can have the controller charging on the dock, pick the controller up, and it will instantly connect to your PC. It's a really great feature. By the way, this controller works with Switch, PC, Android, iOS, and it can even work with Xbox and PlayStation. However, those two last systems require a kind of workaround setup where you need an original controller in the first place. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but it is an option. So this review has been a big one so far, and now it's time to go over the pros, cons, and considerations for the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro Elite controller. First, the pros. And the first is of course the modern game inputs. You get smooth tuned analog sticks with metal collars and an anti-friction ring that does make a genuine difference. You get tactile shoulders, responsive triggers, well-placed macro buttons, and really good gyroscope support. The interchangeable analog sticks, and the 3 different heights included in the box. Not only are the sticks themselves high quality with steel and rubber caps, but it's also nice to have a layer of physical customization. The rubber dotted grips around the back of the controller make it incredibly comfortable to hold, and feels very high quality. The huge amount of extensive real-time customization using the app that even works at the same time as you're playing your game. Nearly all the features on this controller are on board and you don't need the app to set them up. And the 4 buttons along the bottom of the controller make them very intuitive and easy to set up. And of course this controller is absolutely jam-packed with features. You could hardly ask for more than this, especially when it comes to native volume control, which is absolutely fantastic. For me personally, this is one of my favorite features I've ever had on a controller. The intuitively placed macro keys, especially on the top, which are easy to press. The incredibly detailed documentation and support for this controller. It really feels like this company went overboard to make sure that you know how to get the most out of your controller. And finally, it has a decent dock and a great 2.4 GHz dongle, both with USB pass-through included in the price. And I think it brings this controller together as a really great value controller. But now let's talk about the cons. The totally awful D-pad. There's no two ways about it, it's just terrible in every way. And it's practically useless for retro games and fighting games. The weird slippery B button that presses too deep into the case, and is especially problematic if you're using this controller on the Nintendo Switch. And with those two combined, the point is reiterated that this just is not a very good controller for retro gaming. Next is the underwhelming LEDs. This wasn't mentioned earlier in the video, but the LEDs just don't look very good on this controller due to the dark frosted plastic. And the device itself looks much smarter and much cooler with them turned off. Also, there's no strain relief for the USB connection on the top of the controller. This isn't a huge deal, but if you want to use the gyroscope and the wired USB mode, there is some risk of damaging the USB port. And finally, whereas it's great that a dock is included in the price and in the box, the design of it isn't just drop and go, it requires a little finesse to get the controller into place. In summary, the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro is a controller that sets out to be something very specific, a controller for FPS games. And it hits all the points that a controller like that should hit with flying colors, such as the sticks, shoulders, gyroscope, huge amount of customization, and a modern feature set. However, it just lacks a little bit too much in other areas like the D-pad and the face buttons. It feels kind of strange to make this point because you wouldn't, for example, criticize an arcade stick for not working well with first-person shooters. And this controller was designed for shooters, not retro gaming. However, with a more standard gamepad design like this, just because it's great for modern shooters and modern games, shouldn't mean it has to be, well, relatively rubbish for everything else. And also, is it realistically any better for modern gaming than any other modern style gamepad out there? Especially ones that don't have the drawbacks of this one. As a quick example, the FlyDigi Vader 3 Pro review for this thing coming soon. Has excellent controls for modern games, along with the best D-pad and face buttons basically ever. And it's basically a perfect controller for modern and retro games. In the end, the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro is definitely a good controller for its particular target. But its real character shines not through its FPS controls, but through its very, very well thought out feature set, function buttons, and the dock and dongle experience. In my opinion personally, I think this controller would be a fantastic one to pick up for somebody who has a focus on modern gaming, and wants everything including a chargeable dock and a dongle in the box. But if there's any possibility that you might want to play more retro or D-pad focused games, this really isn't the controller to buy. If you're interested in the BigBig Won Rainbow 2 Pro, I'll leave a link to BigBig Won's website in the description box below, where you can check it out for yourself. It's usually available for anywhere between $50 and $70 depending on when and where you buy it, but bear in mind that that price does come with the dock and the dongle and the interchangeable parts included in the box, which makes it really good value for a controller of this quality and feature set. But of course, bear in mind that you might be able to find it a little cheaper on places like AliExpress or Banggood. I want to say a big thanks to BigBig Won for sending me this controller to review. And if you like the look of this controller, please do check out their website for more of their products. That's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching Retro Breeze, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.